Okay. This is Father James Blomley, again at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Murphy. This is, I think, the second installment, I believe. Could be wrong. But anyway, it's another installment in a series of classes that we've been having concerning the Apostolic Fathers. Now, the Apostolic Fathers, to define those would be people in the early church that had at least some contact with the original apostles. And so they were familiar with what that apostle taught. And so many times they would have had, it would have been influenced by the Apostle John, or by Matthew, or by one of the other apostles. And they would take that teaching, and they would go out and they would spread that teaching around among the people. And so that becomes the definition of a person who is an apostolic father. Of course, there are a lot of other people running around who were also teaching, and well. I mean, it's not to say they weren't teaching well, but the ones that had this direct contact with the apostles, people thought, we need to listen to this person. This person has actually heard what the apostle had to say, and many times had heard what Jesus had to say in one context or another. And so this becomes kind of the guidepost, if you will, for determining who an apostolic father is. Well, last week, or last time we were here in any event, we were talking about St. Ignatius. And we were going through a number of letters that he had written to churches in different cities and different places. And for Ignatius, in the letters that we looked at the last time we were here, his primary focus at that time had to do with ecclesiastical structure. And by that I mean who's in charge, what are the roles of all the people in the church, and who kind of has control or supervision over these people. And so for Ignatius, if you remember, he talked about the bishop being the one who is responsible for that church. And remember, at that time, it was still very early on. So at that time, in the same way that we see, for example, Paul, in his letters, he talks about going to one town or another town. He would be there for a while, and then he would go ahead and he would leave the church. He would leave the town, and he'd say, I'm going to make this person into the bishop, which is the equivalent at that time of the priest, and then deacons and that kind of thing. So there was a structure that was left behind to govern the church and to help teach the people and bring people to Christianity. So this was his primary thrust in what we looked at the last time that we were here. And today the thrust is different. And what has happened is that the letters that we looked at the last time around were primarily written in the fairly early days of his imprisonment. You'll remember that he had been arrested by the Romans. He was going to be taken to Rome. He was going to be eaten by the lions or the tigers, whatever animals they had in the Colosseum, which was not an unusual thing to happen to people. This happened all the time. And so in the letters we looked at last time, this was still early in the trip. You know, it's not like they got on a plane and flew to Rome. Instead, they start traveling from here to this city, to this city, to this city. And if memory serves, it took almost 2 years in his case to get from where he was, around Antioch, I believe, to Rome, actually. It just was a long, long trip. Well, in the letters we're looking at today, it's getting closer. And you can tell that this is having an effect on him. It's making him think about not just how the church is going to survive and who is responsible for the church growth and for teaching and all the things that happen in the church. Now he's starting to come to grips with the truth, actually absolute truth, that he's going to die. And he's going to die in a way that really, for the Romans, they believed this to be a shameful way to die. It's certainly undignified, but they had this little ladder, and you could be died in very, what they would think of as an honorable way, or you could die in what they thought of as just a way that people didn't mean anything. They just let them die that way. And so at the top were maybe gladiators who fought against each other. They considered it or wanted it to be something of a fair fight, to the extent they have that. And so then the winner would be given accolades, and the one that lost, it would be considered an honorable death because of this. For people who simply were being executed, who were being thrown to whatever animals were there, lions, tigers, whatever it is. This was considered to be a shameful death, and something that everybody, Rome was a funny town at that time, but everybody went to the Colosseum to see this. It's kind of hard to imagine, you get right down to it. I mean, here we have people with no arms, no way to defend themselves. Oftentimes, as in the case of Ignatius and later on Polycarp, they were pretty old. Polycarp was in his 80s when he underwent this. And it seems an odd way to have any kind of entertainment, but people went there all the time. And it's very much a different culture. It makes even professional wrestling look, not that bad, really. But this is something that at that time, that's simply the way that it was. So today we start with the letter from Ignatius to the Romans. And he spends a lot of this letter talking about his upcoming death. Again, he will mention structure, he'll mention ecclesiastical structure and supervision and who does what. But now you can see his mind just turning towards what's going to happen when he gets to Rome. And so we have, for example, in section 4 of his letter, it says, I am writing to all the churches, and I give injunctions to all men, that I am dying willingly for God's sake, if you do not hinder it. I beseech you, be not an unseasonable kindness to me. In other words, don't stop this. Do this. Pray for me. Suffer me, and then he picks back up again, suffer me to be eaten by the beast, through whom I can attain to God. I am God's wheat, and I am ground by the teeth of the wild beast, that I may be found pure bread of Christ. Well, clearly he has come to grips with what is happening. And clearly it's on his mind. And clearly he understands the real meaning, the real significance of this, which is that he is giving up his life for Christ. That this is simply, this is, if you will, a martyrdom. It is a martyrdom. And so he understands, and I think the early Christians understood very well exactly what martyrdom meant, because it could come in any way, in any number of ways. Martyrdom could happen at the altar of your church in town. Martyrdom could happen 1,000 miles away in Rome. Martyrdom could happen just about any place. And so this is where Ignatius's head is at these days. He understands this. You can tell that he is becoming more and more aware of this. It's occupying his mind to a certain extent. And so a couple of sections later, he goes on and he says, the prince of this world, and we know that is the devil, that's Satan. The prince of this world wishes to tear me in pieces and to corrupt my mind towards God. Let none of you who are present help him. What does he mean by corrupt my mind toward God? And I think what he means by that is this sense that the reason that he has this fear is because there's some part of him or something outside of him that is trying to take away his faith, that is trying to take away his courage. And so he's simply determined. He's absolutely determined that this is not going to happen, that he will suffer the death he's being sent to with no complaints, with no begging for mercy, nothing. He's ready to go. He is ready to do this. And in fact, in the next paragraph, he says, I no longer desire to live after the manner of men, and this shall be if you desire it. Desire it in order that you may also be desired. I beg you by this short letter, believe me, and Jesus Christ shall make this plain to you, that I am speaking the truth. And so he has reached very clearly an impasse. His thinking has changed a lot. His early letters were full of instruction about, remember, there's the bishop, there's the priest. He had a really, really high opinion of deacons. There's the deacons and all of these people. But now he's starting to think about something else. It's not like he's changed his mind on the ecclesiology, but he's starting to think about something else. Well, so that's the letter to the Romans. Now, the next letter that he wrote is to the Philadelphians. And so in this one, it has the same theme. But now he's trying to exhort not only his own courage, but the courage of other people, because he understands that this kind of thing could happen to anybody. That they could go into a church somewhere and take all the people and haul them off to Rome, They could do that if they wanted to, and at times they did. And so because of this, now he wants to kind of turn from that. Turn from the idea of simply, being afraid or not wanting it to happen, to going further than that, to be sure that in dealing with however bad life may be in whatever church you're in, whether it's Philadelphia or wherever else, that what people remember is that they are all members of the same church. They are all people who came under God. They are all people who worship Jesus Christ. They are all people whose lives are dictated by the teachings that Jesus gave them. And so early on in the letter to the Philadelphians, he says this, he says, therefore, as children of the light of truth, flee from division and wrong doctrine. Now, when he says division and wrong doctrine, we all know churches can sometimes get this way. People can, somebody will say, well, this is the right way. I read this, and this is what we have to think about, what we have to do, what we have to follow. And somebody else will say, well, no, here's Ignatius, look what he wrote. It's not quite like that. And then people get into a big brouhaha, and we've been really fortunate in that way, but sometimes that happens. Now, it doesn't happen that much in Orthodox circles, and the reason it doesn't happen that much is because of this ecclesiastical structure that we talked about last week, or the week before last, where the bishop is going to maintain control over whatever becomes controversial, whatever people want to argue about. The bishop himself is going to come forward and say, look, here's the answer. This is what we believe. This is what we believe. And it reminds me of something that happened several years ago in a Greek church in Texas, where there was a couple there where the mom had a little boy. The mom wanted to make that little boy into a little girl, and it was a big deal. The dad did not want it to happen, and the bishop for the Greek church issued this thing that says, this cannot happen. You cannot do this. And the priest in that particular parish picked that up and preached on it for 3 weeks in a row. You cannot do this. Well, he didn't really reach the woman, but it became a real brouhaha. But it does illustrate how these kinds of controversies are supposed to be dealt with. That the bishop is supposed to be the one to say, no, here's what we believe. Here's the truth. You can't go and say the truth is something else. And that's what the bishop here said. And then the priest tried to follow through with the bishop and preached on it and said, you cannot do this. Of course, people cannot listen if they want to. It's free will. If they want to, then they'll do that. But that, I think, was a very excellent illustration of how the principles of Ignatius continue with the church in the present time, where the bishops and the priest and the clergy, they all have this responsibility to teach what the church teaches, and to make sure people understand that maybe there are some things they cannot do. And so that becomes something. Ignatius really laid the groundwork for all of that business. So what it was then is, so in his letter to the Philadelphians, Ignatius points this out. He points out to them about how this is our only guiding stone, our only guiding light. And that is what we have learned from Christ and then from the apostles. That we know these things. We know that they are true. We know that this is very true. So Ignatius goes on and he talks about some experiences he's had where he knows that this is the way in which we are taught and the way in which we know what we can and we cannot do. He talks about in something that in the seventh paragraph, seventh section, it says, even if some desire to deceive me after the flesh, the spirit is not deceived, for it is from God. For it, quote, knoweth whence it comes and whither it goes, close quote, and test secret things. I cried out while I was with you. I spoke with a great voice, with God's own voice. Give heed to the bishop and to the presbytery and to the deacons. And so Ignatius is here and he is telling people, look, you cannot go and change things. You cannot go change things because of fear. You cannot change things because somebody thinks it's a good idea to do it. You cannot do these things because that will tear the church apart. And so that's the second letter that we're looking at tonight, is with the Philadelphians. Now the next one that he writes has to do with, and it's the last one to a church. And he's writing to the Christians in Smyrna, which is not Smyrna, Georgia, but another Smyrna. And so he's writing to them, and it kind of goes off in the same kind of thing. And he is concerned about discord in the church in Smyrna. And so this is something that he wants to talk to them about. And so he tells them, and early on in like the 4th paragraph, he says, "Now I warn you of these things, beloved, knowing that you also are so minded. But I guard you in advance against beasts in the form of men, whom you must not only not receive, but if it is possible not even meet, but only pray for them, if perchance they may repent." So the situation is a little bit different in Smyrna. Smyrna, it sounds like there are people that have been going around saying, "We've got the truth," whatever it is. I don't think he ever mentions what it was they were saying. But they're trying to tell people that what they've been taught in the church and what the bishop says, what the priest says, whatever, is not the truth. That these are simply, that these are really the result of people wanting their own way and coming to people and trying to say, "Oh, they don't know what they're talking about. This is what's true." And so they're setting up really discord between people in the church, which is always the kiss of death for any church, no matter where it is or what it is. The discord kills probably more churches and even more Christians than people can possibly conceive. And in fact, and this isn't just an Orthodox problem, it's a problem with every kind of church out there. And if you kind of listen to people as you go around, oftentimes you'll run into people that'll say, "I used to go to church all the time at, I don't know, that church down there, or this church over here. I was a deacon in that church," whatever it was. And you say, well, you still go there? Go, no, there's a big fight on when I haven't been back since then. And that's a pretty common kind of thing. And so Christians get booted out, or they get tired of it and they just leave on their own. And so so a lot of times they don't even show up again. Well, just because it's common, just because it happens frequently, doesn't make it a good thing. God himself, we know, would have no joy in a place splitting up and breaking up over some kind of dispute between some of the people that are in there. But it happens very frequently. And it's something that for any church, this church, any church at all, there definitely has to be, people have to be aware of this. They have to understand as they're in the church, if they start hearing or people are telling them that the priest is wrong, bishop's wrong, whatever, but this guy over here, Joe, he's got all the answers, then people should just avoid Joe. People should just wait. Maybe Joe's a really bright guy, but he's bringing discord and he's destroying the church itself. All right. So in this one, the letter that he has written here to Smyrna, to the Smyrnians, is heavy on that particular notion. And so he talks about, he says, in fact, in section 6, he says, "Let no one be deceived. Even things in heaven and the glory of the angels and the rulers, visible and invisible, even for them there is a judgment if they do not believe on the blood of Christ." So he's being really very firm, very strong about what has to be done or not done, as the case may be. And so a couple of paragraphs later, he continues, he says, "See that you all follow the bishop, as Jesus Christ follows the Father, and the presbytery, as if they were the apostles, and reverence the deacons as the command of God." It's a funny kind of way that this is kind of offensive to a lot of modern people. I mean, people don't want to be told what they have to believe, or why it's important to believe something, or why they should listen to a bishop or whatever. And that's kind of the way that we are right now. There's not much to be done about it. But it becomes a very difficult thing, and people can lose their faith. They can just stop coming to church. They can stop believing, because they'll say, you've heard people say, Christians are just, they're terrible. They fight all the time. And so this is something that causes people to fall away from Christ, and that's going to be a very, very serious thing. That absolutely is. Well, how serious is it? In the next paragraph, he goes ahead and he says something else. He says, "He who honors the bishop has been honored by God. He who does anything without the knowledge of the bishop is serving the devil." So for Ignatius, this is a very serious thing. For Ignatius, there is no in-between. There is only one truth, and that truth is an ecclesiastical one in which a bishop rules over the church, that the priest is the one who, on the next level, so to speak, who is the presbyter, that teaches and performs the church services, and then the deacons do the will of God and assist. For him, that's all there is. That's the only structure that there is. And if people decide they're going to do something else, then that's going to be a problem as well. So the last thing that we have that Ignatius wrote is the letter to Polycarp, and that's who we're going to start with in just a minute. Now Polycarp, and I think for Father Deacon Maximus, I think Polycarp is his favorite saint of all. He's very, very fond of Polycarp. And Polycarp's story, I think, is a lot like Ignatius's. And I think when this happened to Polycarp, he was, if I remember right, don't take this to the bank, but I want to say he was quite elderly. May have been in his 80s at the time. I don't know. That's just my recollection. Don't take it to the bank. But he had been around, and my understanding of Polycarp is that he had had contact with the Apostle John, had learned from him, kind of sat at his feet, and so a lot of the things that he says kind of reflect what John was teaching. And he was going around talking to people and passing on to them what Jesus had said and done while they were while he was with John. Well, so for what Ignatius wants to say to Polycarp is to underscore what is important from the point of view of the ecclesiastical structure of the church. And a lot of what he says to Polycarp repeats what he said in these other letters to the churches themselves. That he talks about that people act correctly, that they do the right thing. And there are some kind of interesting characteristics or interesting examples of this. And so, for example, he talks about widows and about how widows should be supported and how, in return, widows themselves should behave. He talks about, he says, "Let not the widows be neglected. Be yourself their protector after the Lord. Let nothing be done without your approval, and do nothing yourself without God, as indeed you do nothing. Stand fast. Let the meetings be more numerous. Seek all by their name. Do not be haughty to slaves, either men or women, yet do not let them be puffed up, but let them endure slavery for the glory of God." In the next paragraph, he says, "Flee from evil arts, but rather preach against them. Speak to my sisters that they love the Lord and be content with their husbands in flesh and in spirit." And then in the next one, "Give heed to the bishop, that God may also give heed to you. I am devoted to those who are subject to the bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and may it be mine to have my lot with them in God." And so this is advice that he sends to Polycarp. Polycarp, I think, has not yet started his own journey. His own persecution has not come to fruition. But you can tell that for the early church, that the kind of thoughts that they had, because it was not by any means all, roses and unicorns. It was not an easy thing. It was not like it was here to open a church and hope somebody showed up, because nobody was going to come do anything to us if nobody showed up. But for them, it was that if you go and you open a church, then you have to be careful about who is there, what is said, what is done, and that everything that is said and done is consistent with Christianity itself. That there's not anybody saying, "I believe that we should," whatever. Sometimes people are like, "This is really the way we should do it. We should kick somebody out. We should do whatever." And so that's not necessarily the thing at all that we should be, that people should look for. So this was the advice that he gave to Polycarp for that. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about the epistle that we have of Polycarp, which is really kind of an astonishing thing. He was, we talked about how when he was actually martyred, he was older. He was it was on February 23rd, 155 AD. He was the age of 86. He'd been a disciple of John. And after that, there's some concern. Some people would say, well, that means John the son of Zebedee. Some said, no, that means John the presbyter. I don't know. It was a John. He was a real apostle. Whoever this John was, he followed him. And so it's because of this that Polycarp finds himself in this. So he's the bishop in Smyrna. And we have some other writings, but the one that we have tonight that we want to talk about has to do with the letter he wrote to the Philippians. Paul wrote a letter or two to the Philippians. A lot of people did. That's how people communicated at that time. And so he then goes and he talks about this. He talks about what the Philippians believe and how they govern themselves. And so what they have, when you get down to it, is that he says in the second paragraph, he says, wherefore, girding up your loins, serve God in fear and truth, putting aside empty vanity and vulgar error, believing on him who raised up our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead, and give him glory, and a throne on his right hand, to whom are subject all things in heaven and on earth. And so this sounds very much like Ignatius. We had the same kind of thought, the same kind of belief about how a parish, how a church was to be run. And so all of these things are important. Now, the important thing to think about when we think about this is that for Polycarp at this particular church, what's important is that he saw some evils that we didn't really hear Ignatius talk about. For example, for Polycarp, he said he realizes that discrepancies in money, in the sense that some people have money and they like to flaunt it, and some people don't have any money, that this can be kind of a problem. And so, for example, in paragraph 4, he begins, but the beginning of all evils is the love of money, close quote. Knowing, therefore, that we brought nothing into the world and we could take nothing out of it, let us arm ourselves with the armor of righteousness. Let us first of all teach ourselves to walk in the commandment of the Lord. Next, teach our wives to remain in the faith given to them, and in love and purity, tenderly loving their husbands in all truth, and loving all others equally in all chastity, and to educate their children in the fear of God. Later on, he says, and let the presbyters also be compassionate, merciful to all, bringing back those that have wandered, caring for all the weak, neglecting neither widow nor orphan nor poor, but ever providing for that which is good before God and man. So in a sense, Polycarp's thrust is a little bit different, right? He instead of focusing on the structure itself, he then takes the structure and he says everybody has a role to play. And so he talks about presbyters, and he talks about how they should go and talk to people that have had a misunderstanding of doctrine or upset about something that was said. They should talk to those people. He talked about the way in which wives and mothers should behave as well. And so whereas Ignatius was going to talk about the people in the structure, the bishop and the priest, the presbyter and the deacons, for Polycarp, he's going a little bit further. He's saying, yes, all these people have a role, but because they have this role, everybody has a role. That we expect wives and women to act in a particular way. We expect other people to act in a particular way. We expect older people to act in a particular way. And so because of this, and because of all of these things, that this is, it's the same structure, but people now have clear areas of control, I guess, of things that they are supposed to do. Everybody has a duty. Everybody has things that they should work on and do something about. And in fact, there's an example in this where we hear about a guy who apparently did not want to do this. So in paragraph 11, he starts this, I'm terribly sorry for Valens, V-A-L-E-N-S, somebody's name, for Valens, who was once made a presbyter among you, that he so little understands the place which was given to him. I advise, therefore, that you keep from avarice and be pure and truthful. Keep yourselves from all evil. In other words, balance in whatever way, it's unclear to me, you guys may have a better idea, did not behave in the way that he should have as a presbyter. Now, whether he's fully off or not, or whether they're trying to get him back into business, whatever that might be, we don't really know. But it does show that at least in some places, and it did here, that sometimes somebody in the priesthood or a deacon, I guess, or even a bishop, we've seen that from time to time, can fall out of their ability to do what God has given them to do. And so that is something, and that certainly is a rule up to the present time. A bishop can always tell a priest, you're done, go home. And tell a deacon the same thing. It's harder to move a bishop, but there are ways, I guess, to do it. Everybody's accountable for what they do, what they say, and the way in which they govern the church, if that's part of what their job is. And so these things are things that are important. So the interesting thing about all this to me is that, number one, that as far as Ignatius goes, he is more, for the letters we read about today, he is more acutely aware of what awaits him. He is getting closer and closer to Rome, and he knows that when that day comes, that he knows what's going to happen. And so he's talking a little bit more about that, a little bit less about structure, and a little bit more about that. He writes to Polycarp to try to encourage him in the same kind of way. And then from Polycarp we hear about people, and for Polycarp in this letter, if we try to figure out one overriding theme, probably that has to do for Polycarp about instances such as Valens, instances where somebody who has authority either does not use the authority properly or abuses the authority. We don't know exactly what Valens did, but he has been removed. And so we're kind of circling in a little bit, if you will. Instead of talking about a church per se, now we're talking about the people that have been assigned or given places in that church, places of responsibility. And so because of that, we're starting to zero in a little bit on these things. It's really interesting. Both Ignatius and Polycarp they're just giants among the people that lived at that time. They really were. They're just they're held in really high regard, and people learn a lot from that. But I think that is something that that's pretty important in the stories, in their stories. We kind of see a foreshadowing of some things that we run into occasionally in modern times. And for us, the answers are the same as they were for Ignatius and Polycarp if there are issues in the church or problems in the church. And that would mean, basically, if I just went off the wheels, and off the curb, and I was just doing weird stuff, and I was preaching who knows what, you guys, the right thing to do would be to call the bishop and say, he's freaked out. You have to help us on this. And he would. He'd figure out what's going on. Same thing with the deacon. Same thing with pretty much everybody. And so the same way that these two men look at the church and how it's run is that pretty much, to a large extent, pretty much the same thing that's going on now in churches all over the world. As far as an organization goes. And it works pretty well. You occasionally hear about problems in an Orthodox church, but it's not, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be terribly frequent. Anybody got any thoughts about any of this? Okay. All right. That is what I've got tonight. The next person, actually after this, and we already did this by and large, we can go back if people have questions about it. There's a long section on the Didache, and so we'll think about that. But then after that's the Shepherd of Hermas, which is a really great piece of work. It's pretty amazing. That itself, I think, had its supporters, you know, to put it in the Gospels, and it didn't make it, but a lot of people think that it could. So that's what we'll look at next time. All right? All right. In the name of the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.
Okay. Thanks, George. Let's see, sleeping.
Was the Shepherd's Bush written by St. Hermas? I know that he's commemorated in March.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm not. Let me see what it says real quick.
I don't know when I read that in the book. I really did enjoy that.
Read it as well. And then the detail of the
My favorite part of that is the angel that over and over again keeps saying, "Play the man, Hermes, play the man."
I remember, like, they describe the towers, like the white blocks and the mountains and the just all so full of symbols. I need to go back to it.
Very
definitely.
eye-opening.
It is, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Dad recommended. He's always talking about having like a children's book, more Orthodox children's books.
Yeah.
That being one of them.
Yeah.
Like the detail that would be a good one.
That would be a good one. That would be pretty cool.
Cool illustrations for that too.
I like it.